we've heard from many policymakers across the region that they're basically saying, don't worry about higher rates in the U.S. I'm just wondering, do we really have an idea, the extent to which the Fed can bring this up? Because this doesn't happen every year.
Actually, I think that remark, don't worry about it, may be true for the United States, but not true for Asia. For U.S., actually, this higher inflation is part due to their higher demand, not only just for the Ukraine and this kind of war impact. So they have a room to, do the increase interest rate and still want to fight high inflation. But on the other hand, if you look at the Asia is now moving toward the recovery process from the COVID of last year. But now the inflation is much higher due to the Ukraine war. On top of it, this high interest rate will increase the borrowing cost in many Asian countries, and which actually increased the leverage ratio in the last 10 years. For example, in 2007, Asia accounted for only 25% of global debt, but now it accounts 38% of global debt. So this higher global interest rate will definitely reduce the growth momentum in Asia. And then, the high inflation due to Ukraine war is definitely make the trade-off between the higher inflation and growth much more complicated in Asia. So it's not a good news.
In what way do you think this will affect most economies, this part of the world? Is it outflows? You mentioned high borrowing costs. What do we need to watch out for?
Financial market, definitely there is a possibility of outflow of capital. I'm not talking about that will cause a financial crisis like in 1997. But I think this higher borrowing cost and exchange rate pressure will definitely slow down Asia's recovery. And there are many other different channels that these things together with, that this U.S. monetary policy normalization is on top of the unexpected news of Ukraine war. And it really affects Asian economies quite in a different way. For emerging and developing Asia countries, higher food and energy prices is the main channel, and that will reduce the real income of Asian countries, especially poor households. On the other hand, for advanced Asian economies, on top of the inflation, the trade slowdown of Europe, which is directly affected by the Ukraine war, and also more importantly, slowdown of the China, as you have discussed. So on top of this trade channel is also another important negative shock to Asia at this moment.
So Changyong, can you talk a little bit more about the Ukraine crisis? Obviously, we've seen energy prices really impact Asian economies here. Do you foresee that higher PPI prices in Asia, could that spill over to global inflation?
Not at this moment. We're seeing that China's purchasing power, China's PPI inflation is higher, but still it's not directly translated into the consumer price increase. And that is not yet kind of spread out to the world. But if the oil price continue to increase and producer cost increase, then it's inevitable that eventually it will come to the price of the commodity, retail goods too. And that stages inflation can, China can and Asian can export inflation further to the world. But it is not yet at the stages.
We have seen, though, inflation at least build in this part of the world. The likes of Sri Lanka, I guess you could say, is seeing one of the worst inflation pictures we've seen in Asia. I'm just wondering, they did a bit of a policy U-turn. They have gone to the IMF now, seeking for assistance. Have you received a formal request by Sri Lanka for that assistance?
Yes, I think we received the President of Sri Lanka's request to work together with us. So we are preparing for the programs. But I think Sri Lanka is not a good example to explain the inflation rate in Asia in general. Sri Lanka has been under this pressure for a long time, and exchange rate really depreciated. That is another reason of the high inflation in Sri Lanka. In Asia, overall, inflation rate is a little bit lower than the global averages in the last 1 year, and we actually expected that Asia's inflation will peak in the second half of this year rather than the first half, with a little bit lower, basis compared with other countries. But given the Ukraine war, I think the inflation is now actually increasing faster than we expected.